All right, guys, I just want to welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here will be breaking down the news of Pete Golding leaving Alabama for Ole Miss, leaving a vacancy at the defensive coordinator position on Nick Saban's staff. What he leaves behind is 5 years of experience as the Alabama defensive play caller. Why it makes sense for him to leave, Nick, I'm not really sure. I think a fresh start under another ex-Saban coordinator in Lane Kiffin. That's, one thing I think I'm kind of leaning towards here is just a fresh start because he's kind of been underwhelming at Alabama. That hasn't exactly been the greatest, average of 18.8 points per game over those 5 years. Never allowed less than 18.1 points per game during his tenure in a season. 323.6 yards per game on average over his 5 years, though. That's a phenomenal yardage total. But this Alabama defense has certainly lacked kind of the tenacity that it had prior to Golding arriving, though. Production on the defensive line since Quentin Williams in 2018, which was a Golding coach defense, has been lacking immensely. I certainly think that, the linebacking core has certainly dropped off a good bit. Again, the defensive line, they've just not been elite up front. And this past year, they really struggled in the secondary the last 2 years, really, which I certainly didn't expect. I really thought this would be a Nick Saban vintage secondary last year. They disappointed, and it wasn't any better this year, only 7 interceptions. And they also allowed 185 rushing yards or more in 4 of the last 5 games. Defense has been really good here at Alabama, Nick, but obviously it's not been as elite as it has in the past. Certainly doesn't match up to that of Georgia's over the last couple of years. It's certainly now taken that standard in college football on defense. Overall, Pete Golding, I think he's an underwhelming play caller, and he leaves for a less desirable job at Ole Miss. Yeah, I don't really think he took this job as serious. He's only about 38 years old, so he's still very young. He did have a DUI before the season. And again, the defenses have never been elite here at Alabama. I just kind of feel like he kind of threw an opportunity away here, and now he's going to go to Ole Miss for a lesser job. What are your overall thoughts on Pete Golding? Do you think I'm being too harsh, or is it on par?
I didn't expect Pete Golding to leave this offseason. If he did leave, I expect him to take a job as a head coach somewhere in the lower tier program. I consider this a bit of a lateral move. I think this doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Golding overall. His defenses have been disappointing. He's definitely received the brunt of a lot of fans' anger. Offensive coordinator Bill O'Brien has also received some anger from fans this past season. This defense over the past couple seasons has not quite been very good. I look back to the Ole Miss game in 2020 where Lane Kiffin drew up a fantastic offense that day and really, put up a ton of points against Alabama. I wanted to fire Pete Golding on the spot that day. He ended up, kind of settling down a little bit. Defense got a little bit better as the season went on, but overall his defenses have struggled. The interior has definitely struggled, like you said, since Quentin Williams left. I will say Pete Golding is a fantastic recruiter, right? He's been one of the Tide's bigger recruiters over the last few seasons. He nails Louisiana, the state that he was born in, the state that he grew up. He went to Delta State, and that in the state of Louisiana, he's nailed recruiting there, and I think they're going to lose that sort of piece, and that may be why Lane Kiffin looked for his defensive coordinator as Ole Miss gets another defensive coordinator after going through multiple over the last couple of seasons. I think Kiffin wants to kind of tap into that Louisiana recruiting market to try and build up his roster because Ole Miss, Kiffin still feels he can get Ole Miss to a higher tier than they already are, even though I think you and I agree that he might have reached his peak at Ole Miss so far. I think this is kind of an opportunity here for Alabama to potentially have 2 new total coordinators. And of course, when you consider Nick Saban coach team, he's going to have a lot of influence on the defense. So I think that this gives Golding opportunity to be at a program where it's not going to be a head coach that has a very defensive-minded game plan like Nick Saban does. Kiffin, of course, a more of an offensive-minded kind of coach. I think this is a good opportunity for Golding, and it's a better opportunity for Alabama to kind of try to find a new guy who can kind of step in there and lead this defense and try and get it back to what they used to be.
I do not believe Lane Kiffin has reached his ceiling with Ole Miss, but I do think this Golding hire, like you said, with the recruiting, certainly is going to give them a little bit of a boost on the side of the ball. They've really struggled on the last couple of years. Looking at a handful of candidates to replace him, I think the first one here, Nick, the most notable is going to be Jeremy Pruitt. This is going to be a hot topic, especially on Twitter. Very popular name. The only backdoor, though, it's going to be a tough ask to hire him. The violations at Tennessee, I do not believe they're resolved one bit from a couple of years ago, which, really seemed like he was building something there at Tennessee. He ended up getting fired. Josh Heupel somehow comes in and saves the program. Just A-plus work from him because Pruitt really had them down in the dumps from the aftermath of him getting fired. The notable experience he has, though, I think, the stretch he had where he won a natty at Florida State, a couple of years at Georgia, and then, the 3 stints at Alabama, one coming after being at Georgia. One of the greatest stretches of jobs you can have in that small span of time. When he was here at Bama, 13 points per game in 16, 11.9 the next in 2017, top 2 in total defense both years. There's also the inside linebacker coach, Sean Deion Hamilton, Reuben Foster, or Sean Evans. Those guys all got drafted. Those were some of the notables in that 2-year span. Very innovative coach. Cover 2, cover 4, split-lit, safety looks. for years have been tough for offenses to crack. His pass defenses have been elite with that scheme. They had 19 interceptions in 2017. This was just such a fast defense with him coaching wherever he's been at. The ability to coach his secondaries and set them up for success, to understand his personnel, has certainly allowed him to thrive. It allows a lot of offenses just checking down or having headaches the entire game. Yards were hard to find against Jeremy Pruitt defenses. I think this is the best hire for Alabama. And of course, what happened at Tennessee with how Alabama's been able to, Nick Saban rather, been able to kind of save these guys' career. Jeremy Pruitt really fits the bill here to continue that trend. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense, Nick, but the reason it doesn't make sense, I think, is really going to stand out. What do you think is going to happen here?
I think Jeremy Pruitt is the best option available for Alabama. He seems to fit the mold perfectly for me. Played at Alabama under Gene Stallings, was a graduate assistant. Then he coached in high school in Alabama at Hoover High School. Of course, the famous high school here in Alabama, Hoover. At Florida State under Jimbo Fisher, won a national championship. Georgia, back to Alabama, won a national championship back at Alabama. Of course, he had his time at Tennessee, which, ended very poorly, but he was sort of, it seemed like they were trending in the right direction. They won that bowl game in 2019. They had that solid season. I think they beat Indiana in that bowl game. He spends a year at the Giants in the NFL, senior defensive assistant. Kind of since then been out of work. I think Pruitt makes the most sense here for Alabama. His defense was fantastic, and Golding was also the inside linebackers coach in addition to being the defensive coordinator. So it's an easy kind of slot to fit in there, right? Replace one with another
coaching style.
I would be concerned with the obvious previous allegations at Tennessee. Of course, we all know what happened with the McDonald's bag, all that stuff, all the rumors there. But I think Hugh Freeze getting the job at Auburn this past season kind of makes me believe the SEC may not be as harsh on hiring coaches that have disciplinary problems in the past. I think they may be willing to let it slide if these coaches have spent some time away from the conference. And of course, Nick Saban, known as more of a career rehabilitator, bringing back Sark, bringing back other guys, Butch Jones, another example like that. So I think this makes a lot of sense for both parties. I think Jeremy Pruitt would be a perfect fit. A lot of Alabama fans I know here in Tuscaloosa want Jeremy Pruitt back. He's got to be the front runner for me, and I would hope that they can kind of figure this out and get this deal done.
Yeah, like you said, the Nick Saban Rehabilitation Center might be a reason why the NCAA or even the SEC are a little bit more keen on allowing this hire to happen. Next up, Jim Leonhard. I made a video recently on why USC should give Leonhard a look, but I think it makes a lot of sense. If they can't have Pruitt, Leonhard needs to be the next option. They've had among the nation's top run defenses the past couple seasons at Wisconsin. The aggression his front seven unleashes, mixed with him being an ex-DB coach, really checks all the boxes. This secondary, I think, because Nick Saban's also a phenomenal DB coach, could really get back to playing elite ball. And then, Jim Leonhard has thrived at utilizing the three-star worst talent, some of these under-recruited guys. And then you look at a guy like Nick Herbig at Wisconsin, who's one of the better recruits in Wisconsin's time, was one of the best players in college football this past year. And, that's all he's going to be working with here. High-end 4 stars, elite 5-star recruits. The 3-4, that's what he ran at Wisconsin, so not much of a scheme change. I do not anticipate Nick Saban will opt for a scheme change. That does not seem like something that's on the table. So I think that's why Leonhard is going to be able to come in here and fit right in. Just a violent, tough defense. His defenders up front, they fight. They unlock the opportunity for the linebackers to thrive. Those were the playmakers for Wisconsin, was the linebackers. Bama doesn't exactly utilize the outside linebackers like Leonhard does, more so there to contain against the run. You like to get a lot of pass rush out of the outside linebackers here at Alabama. So certainly a little bit of differing styles, I think, with the outside linebackers. But all in all, I think Leonhard makes a lot of sense. Very disciplined on the edge, regardless, though. They've only allowed 100 rushing yards once in the last 3 years, and that was against Ohio State. I think this is a great fit for Jim Leonhard in Alabama, and I think Leonhard, if he comes here, coaches for a couple of seasons, he could set himself up for a prominent Power 5 head coaching job.
I think Jim Leonhard makes a lot of sense for Alabama. Like you said, I think he has potential here to come to Alabama and set himself up for a potential head coaching role. We saw him as the interim head coach for the Wisconsin Badgers this past season, 5-3 record overall, including a guaranteed rate bowl win over Oklahoma State. So I think, it's known that he can lead a locker room. The scheme fit is perfect, right? I agree with you. Nick Saban's not going to try and do anything radical and change 3-4. I think that's what he wants to rock with. So Jim Leonhard coaching that, I think, kind of fits in perfectly here. I think Leonhard's got to be a name that if they don't get Pruitt, they got to land Jim Leonhard for me. I think he's a young, energetic guy on the sidelines, a lot of energy here. I think he's a perfect fit in terms of what you want to do to kind of mold a potential future head coach. Nick Saban, of course, he's not going to coach forever, right? If you got a guy like Jim Leonhard in there, a couple seasons he sticks around, it could be potentially, if it all works out, could replace Saban, right? I know I'm speculating with that, but I think Jim Leonhard is a perfect fit here. I think the physical defenses he has at Wisconsin, playing the 3-4, fits perfectly in the SEC. I think his defenses will be able to dominate and get back to sort of that tough hitting Alabama defense that we're used to.
Looking at another candidate that's kind of under the radar. Don't expect him to get a job, but I think he might be in the running. Charlie Strong, notable experience. He's, of course, been a head coach at 4 different schools, jumped around a good bit over the last decade. Was with Alabama as, I think, an analyst in 2020. Why it makes sense. He's still a really good coach. The scheme requires some of the same principles that have been a staple here at Alabama. But one thing he does run is a hybrid scheme, and that certainly might be one of the back draws. But he requires his front three to be strong, the secondary to be athletic. I think that's why this might be a good fit. We won't talk much about Charlie Strong because I think that's all that really needs to be said. But this is certainly a guy that's, I think, still an asset to teams. Urban Meyer added him to his staff in Jacksonville. So obviously some high-profile guys still think very highly of Charlie Strong. So I think Saban might give him some consideration, especially if some of these other candidates are not going to be in the running or they do not accept the job here. How do you feel like Charlie Strong potentially ended up in Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, I think this could be a potentially good fit. Defensive analyst in 2020, hired as a co-defensive coordinator from Miami as they kind of try to rebuild their program in South Florida. Good experience in the past, 2-time Big East champion, Sugar Bowl champion with Louisville. Didn't really work out at Texas, kind of fell apart. And obviously South Florida, it's a tough job to take at South Florida. So I think that's not really his fault. I'm not going to kind of fault him on that one. The jump from Louisville to Texas was probably too much for him. He kind of bit off more than he could chew, I think, making that move. I think he's got a good, coaching resume, solid stops over here, coached at Florida in the past to Urban Meyer, of course, rejoined Urban Meyer, the Jaguars, although that was a bit of a train wreck, and now is down in South Florida with Miami. I think if Alabama whiffs on a few different guys, this could be a good backup option, but certainly not the guy I'd love to be running out to the gates for.
Looking at the next candidate, a guy that's, I don't think, going to even get a call because Nick Saban knows this guy is destined for much bigger and better things, even though defensive coordinator Alabama is obviously a high-profile gig. DeMeco Ryans is likely to be an NFL coach here in a couple of weeks. All-American at Alabama in 2005, Defensive Player of the Year in the conference. Played in the NFL as an elite linebacker from 2006 to 2015. He's been on the 49ers staff since 2017. And just that short amount of time, he's already ready to be a head coach. But I definitely think this is a good opportunity for Ryans to go from Kyle Shanahan to Nick Saban, potentially as a kind of a one-year rental, I would say, even though I do think staying in San Francisco is more likely if he does not entertain any of these lesser desirable jobs, maybe like the Texans in the NFL. Plenty of cover 3 is utilized in San Francisco. They also run that 3-4, so obviously it'd be a nice little fit. A young coach with energy, understands his personnel very well, is also a thriving inside linebacking coach. So he checks off a lot of boxes. The 49ers defense is probably the best in the NFL right now because, again, he understands his personnel tremendously. I think the opportunity to work with all these 5-star talents would be great. I do see one benefit of Ryan doing this is it would be a bit of a downgrade going from potentially being an NFL head coach to the Alabama defensive coordinator, is he could really learn a lot more by doing this. Obviously, he might be jumping down from the NFL level, but I think the knowledge and the experience he can gain, even if he's here for a year, would be incredibly valuable for Ryans, even though I do not believe he'll probably get a call because I don't think he's going to stick around long. And how much cover 3 will Saban want to employ, I think, is something that has to be questioned as well. I do think this makes a lot of sense. It also there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't make sense. How do you feel about DeMeco Ryans potentially ending up here at Alabama?
Yeah, I think this would be a lot of fun. You went to Alabama, obviously played at this program, so has some ties here. Certainly doing a good job with the San Francisco 49er defense. This has been a fantastic defense so far this season. Last year, interviewed for the coaching vacancy with the Minnesota Vikings, right? So he's got some interest potentially be a head coach in the past. I think, this would be a great hire to have, kind of get someone back that has ties to the program. But I agree with you. The issue for me is that he probably is looking ahead and seeing the future is looking very bright in the NFL potentially, and jumping down to the college game might be an adjustment he's not ready for. Of course, the two games are different, and the adjustment from the pros to college and vice versa can be difficult at times. So I think DeMeco Ryans might opt to stay in the NFL, just kind of focus and keep the path that he's on, because right now he's building a fantastic defense in San Francisco and has potential to kind of turn himself into an NFL head coach very soon.
The final candidate we hear outside of Jeremy Pruitt, I think Glen Schumann is probably going to be one of the co-favorites to land this gig. He's been on the Georgia staff since 2016, 2008, 2014. He was on the Alabama staff. Of course, this is his alma mater. I do not believe age is a problem here because Pete Golding was a little bit older. He's around the same age, 32 years old when he took this job. Co-defensive coordinator with the Bulldogs since 2019. Of course, he's been an inside linebacker coach for them, which is a strong part of that Bulldog defense. Those inside linebackers are very well coached, and they're big-time leaders. The football IQ, just all around inside linebackers of Georgia have been terrific. The opportunity to have some sole control over a defense, I think that's why it's going to be incredibly desirable for him. Back to where he graduated as well. Why it doesn't make sense, though, is no experience as a sole play caller on defense. That might be one of the back draws that Saban potentially has. And he doesn't have Kirby or Will Muschamp to hold his hand. Of course, Nick Saban's right there with him. But this is a very well-rounded defense at Georgia. It's not been due to one guy. Of course, Dan Lanning was there last year. I mean, there's multiple guys in that system helping, making sure things are going smooth. So that's one thing that would not be here at Alabama. It would be more of a sole control thing for him, and that might be a back draw. How do you feel about that, Nick?
I think it could work. I think Glen Schumann, of course, alma mater, went to Alabama. You got the ties to Tuscaloosa, worked with Kirby Smart in Alabama when he was here. I think this could be an exciting thing for Alabama to get someone in young that's going to be able to build here and coach for a while. This guy's highly motivated. He works hard. Yes, obviously a co-defensive coordinator you could kind of be a little shy about, but I think that could potentially be the way of the future here for hiring someone. It's going to be tough to land a guy who's in a more stable role. He's worked hard at Georgia. His defense obviously has been fantastic. Of course, it's hard to tell how much the credit goes to Schumann because, of course, Kirby Smart, Will Muschamp, of course, are calling the plays as well. I think this hire would make a whole lot of sense for Alabama. Bring a guy back to Alabama, been on the staff, knows Nick Saban, former Nick Saban assistant. And we saw how it's worked out. Dan Lanning, of course, took the head coaching job at Oregon, so it works out to kind of make a move like that. I think this fit works well for both parties involved. I think this would be good for Alabama and kind of a way to get someone who has experience with Alabama and can kind of get back into the recruiting and try and fill the recruiting void that Pete Golding's leaving.
I definitely think he'd be the best candidate to be in this position for the next 5 years compared to anyone else on this list. I don't think they'd be around as much as long as he probably would. So definitely think he might get a call at the top of the list for Saban. That's going to be it for today's episode, guys. As always, Nick, I appreciate you joining me. And this is a nice storyline to think, to watch here this offseason. Should be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing who Alabama replaces Pete Golding with. I think Alabama should end up replacing both their coordinators by the time the offseason is done. It'll be interesting to see how they kind of develop, and Nick Saban moves forward with 2 new coordinators after a team that really has disappointed over the past 2 seasons.
Yeah, Bill O'Brien potentially might be headed back to the NFL. We'll see what happens if he does, and of course, we'll make a video on that as well. Should be interesting to see what happens. As always, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.